we'll start our second panel. And the title of this panel is Cloud Computing Worldwide in Latin America Opportunities. And we will have two panelists, and I will be the moderator. Our first panelist is Brian Cooper, who is a software engineer on research team at Google. Previously, he was principal research scientist at Yahoo Research. His interests include web search, distributed information system, and database. Before that, he was an assistant professor at Georgia Tech, where he worked on self-managed peer-to-peer overlays and distributed network event processing. His PhD dissertation examined adaptive overlay for replicating data and for searching for the replicated data once it has been scattered through a network. Brian received his PhD in 2003 from Stanford University, where he worked in the database group, digital library project, and peer-to-peer agreement. His dissertation advisor was Hector Garcia Molina. Brian also received his Master of Science from Stanford in 2000, and his Bachelor in Computer Science and Bachelor of Art in Chemistry from the University of Colorado. Please welcome.
All right, I'll just talk. I don't need to. Computers. Thank you for having me on this panel and for actually having me at this conference. It's been very exciting seeing all the things that you guys are working on, lots of interesting research. You can see it's exciting to kind of go back and start doing work again. I've been keeping notes throughout the conference about some opportunities that I think are available in the cloud space, and that, since that's the topic of this panel, is available opportunities, especially for Latin American cloud developments. And so I'd like to share with you things that I've learned and seen at this conference as well as other places. So the first thing I'd like to point out is that cloud systems have been around for a few years, but obviously there's a lot of potential. And part of the reason for that is that there's a huge amount of potential in the internet space as a whole. If you think about cloud service, one of the main uses of it is to deploy web applications, websites, web services. And of course, the growth of the web means you're going to need more and more infrastructure to support those applications. So looking at some statistics from the World Bank, in the last 12 years, the growth of the internet in North America has been 153%, which is amazing. I mean, that's a great amount of growth. But in Latin America and the Caribbean, it's been over 1,100%, right? So there's just a huge amount of growth in this region in terms of people using the internet, getting on the internet to do various things. And there's still a lot more growth potential to be had. Even without all that growth over the last 12 years, only 43% of people in Latin America are currently on the internet, right? Whereas in North America and Europe, it's up over 85%. So there's still a lot of growth to be had. And so there's still a lot of opportunities to build the right kinds of infrastructure, the right kinds of cloud services that'll get us where we need to be to support all those internet users. And if you can see my computer now, I have a beautiful map of the world, right? And the different regions where different people are using the internet, and you would see that there is more dark blue in South America in terms of people using it than in some other regions, but it still is not as dark as it could be. And it varies from place to place. Brazil actually has one of the larger proportions of people using the internet. Other countries in South America and Latin America, not so much yet. So again, the growth potential is there. So we really have an opportunity now, and it's really exciting to see people from this area coming together to try and develop the next set of services because there is so much potential. So one of the things that I think that has really come out from talking to people here and thinking about what's coming up next is sort of what kinds of specific cloud services you need for this region and for the various parts of this region. Okay? So in particular, not every part of Latin America or the world for that matter has really good connectivity to the internet, has really good connectivity to the cloud providers, and therefore it's difficult for them to get to the data. So even though over the past 5 years, the amount of bandwidth coming into Latin America has increased by a factor of 12, right? There's still a huge disparity. The amount of bandwidth you get in a place like Panama, for example, is 10 times larger than you might get in another country like Bolivia. Okay? So there are places where people aren't on the internet, and perhaps part of the reason that there are compelling services for them yet is that the bandwidth just isn't there. But the cloud gives us a nice opportunity to kind of remedy that problem, right? Just because the cloud is a data center full of servers in Sao Paulo or in the United States doesn't mean that that's where all the cloud data has to live. It would be very interesting, for example, to think of what kind of localized cloud services you could build in Bolivia, for example, to help remedy that bandwidth problem. Do we need some sort of caching infrastructure to make sure that the data can be kept locally near the users that would be using it? Do we need to have some sort of smaller, cloudlet or a portion of the cloud where the data can live in various places where there's not great connectivity? So thinking not just about the cloud as a monolithic thing that lives in one data center somewhere, but actually as a regionally optimized set of technologies that gives you the amount of data you need for the place where you are, dealing with whatever challenges in terms of bandwidth or whatever else, that might be an interesting direction where people like yourselves, like us, that are experts in the cloud can deal with. Another thing that I think is very interesting is that there's a lot of potential for using mobile devices to access applications and data that are living in the cloud, right? I mean, we've heard a lot about this over the past two days, about how the cloud really is something that enables mobile devices to provide a lot of interesting experiences. And I've been sitting in the chair here at the conference watching everybody on their iPhones and a few Android phones, right? But that's actually a rarity in most of the world, and including here in Latin America. Most people in this region don't have smartphones, they don't have iPhones and Android devices. I think the most use number that I have here is that 17% of Latin American phone users have a smartphone. The other 83% have what we call a feature phone, right? It's a very basic phone, which can be connected to the internet, which can provide very interesting internet services, which can connect to the cloud, but is not going to give you all the capabilities that an iPhone or an Android phone will give you. So what kind of cloud services could we build that might actually make the experience more compelling for those users? Perhaps we need to have some sort of gateway that allows them to connect to the same cloud services, but translated into a gateway service that makes it easier to deal with the limited connectivity to the feature phone, with the limited screen space on the feature phone. There might even be new and different types of applications that are unique to the feature phone that can still be deployed on the cloud. So the cloud gives us an opportunity really to spin up and try out a lot of different kinds of applications very quickly, see what works and see what doesn't work. And I think it would be great to use that opportunity to really serve that 83% of people here in Latin America that are using feature phones. Maybe someday they might be on smartphones, maybe not. Maybe it's economically just a more viable proposition to have a feature phone, and then we need to be able to serve that. So, you know, thinking about what kinds of cloud infrastructure, what kinds of cloud architectures can support feature phones is a very important direction as well. Another area that I think, obviously, you're all interested in is research, and I've been very excited about the research that I've seen here. There's a lot of cool things going on. And you know, it's really a nice opportunity that there's so much activity, and it seems like you're getting to sort of a critical mass, and there's enough people that are working in this area that it would be a very useful contribution to the cloud sciences. And one thing that I really like about some of the things that I saw here that I don't necessarily see at other conferences that I've been to talking about the cloud is that there's a lot of open source implementations available of things you guys are working with. So it's not just we did these experiments, and we wrote a paper and we were done, but you know, you can go to this website and download. And I think that encouraging that, continuing to open things up and making things available is really a great way to move forward. You know, also a good way to pursue research is to try and collaborate as much as possible with the cloud providers. I know that large companies like mine are not always the easiest to work with, are not always the most forthcoming with information, but as much as possible, you know, these relationships are very important. This is sort of where I can ask you to send your best students to us to come be interns. You know, they can come and work at Google or other companies, I suppose, and learn about some of the challenges that we have, some of the data that we have, and really take those learnings back to the research group when they go back. Of course, you know, when they graduate, they're always willing to come work for us, so they're really, really good as well. Another thing that I thought was interesting about some of the talks that I saw at this conference and some of the things that I've heard is an effort towards making test beds available for people to do research. You know, there's a lot of people who have gotten accounts on Amazon Web Services or Google App Engine and done a variety of interesting experiments, and then sort of complained that it was hard to manage the budget of it, or that you didn't really get as much benefit for your particular workload. And then I see other efforts from people developing software to simulate the cloud. It would be really interesting to see if there was some way to have some sort of regional cloud test bed that people could use. You know, we've seen this work in other examples. For example, in the global computational community, where they have the grid services, there's a common set of protocols, there's a common set of resources where you can really use different resources according to the same communication protocols. Having something like that where there's a test bed that people can use here would be really interesting. It can almost be based on sort of like the Planet Lab model. The Planet Lab is something familiar with. It's an idea where a bunch of different universities each contributed like 2 servers, right? And you got enough universities together that you had something like 300 or 400 servers all around the world. And they were made available as a sort of global test bed for people to do network research on. Okay? So the model there was not that any individual university or even any individual corporation had to contribute a large number of servers, but everybody put in a little bit, and the aggregate together made a very interesting large-scale test bed. Something like that for the cloud, even not just for Latin America, but really for the researchers around the world, could really accelerate research. There's so many papers that have been written using Planet Lab because those research groups didn't have to spend 2 years building their own cloud. They had the cloud available and they were able to use it. So that's another opportunity where research could really be accelerated and work in this area. I also want to make a pitch for startups. There's a lot of interesting activity that comes out of startups, not only globally, but also here in Latin America. I was reading that there's this conference in the US called TechCrunch Disrupt, which is like this up-and-coming startup conference. A lot of people go and pitch their ideas and try and get funding or whatever. And at the most recent one here in 2012, they had 50 different startups from Latin America. Okay, so there's a lot of Latin American startup activity in technology in a lot of different areas. And I think that's because there seems to be a lot of very strong graduates and engineers working in this area. I read that there was something like 60,000 engineering graduates in Brazil last year. Okay, so that's a lot of talented people who could really provide a nice tool for startups. And I think that a lot of startups could be attacking things in the cloud space. I mean, one thing that I saw throughout this conference is people taking real problems that they have and trying to solve them on the cloud with real solutions. Well, let's make those into commercialized solutions that we can sell to other people. I think there's sometimes a tendency in the academic community to say, well, startups, that's sort of looting our brand, and it's sort of not really what we want to do. It doesn't have to be that way, right? A lot of really interesting startups started as academic projects. I mean, Google is a great example. So it was a research project at Stanford before it ever became a company. And it was released into the wild as a startup and became a very successful company. And that's a really interesting model for taking technologies that you've thought about in the universities. You've taken a couple of years to develop, PhD students have worked on them and thought about them and really thought about what the model is and what the thing it should be. But then they take the next step and they leave the university, hopefully, right? And they commercialize them and turn them into real companies that can really benefit the whole world and the whole economics of the region. So I think there's a great potential for that as well. And cloud, it's new enough that there's enough stuff that doesn't quite work yet, that there's a lot of potential for people in that area to really develop new companies. And I would, in particular, make a mention of two kinds of startups that I think would really be matching the talents of some of the people that I've seen here as well as the needs of the cloud industry. One is tools really to help people with the cloud deployments. And I talked about this a little bit yesterday. It's just too hard for clients to develop on the cloud. I've seen a lot of talks here about tools for helping you choose which cloud provider or orchestrate your various cloud instances. That's all very useful. I think the tools that go even further that help you, once you've selected a cloud provider, help you to develop specifically for that provider, optimize your usage for that provider, try and get the most bang for your buck. These kinds of tools are really missing today, and it would be really great to have startups in that area. And another set of startups that are interesting, especially on a regional basis, are sort of information startups. So in the US, there's this company that my friend works for called Factual, which is sort of a provider of data. That's all they do. They take data sets, they curate them, they clean them, they make them really useful, and they provide them. And they tend to be very localized data sets, things like restaurant reviews in Los Angeles and maps in the Bay Area. Those kinds of things are localized by nature. And having data about Latin American things, Latin American restaurant reviews, or Latin American data sets that really can be resold to other companies that need to benefit from them. That's a very interesting business model. It really takes people that understand the local region and can gather that data and really do the right thing with it in order for that to work. So I think there really is a lot of different opportunities that I mentioned. It's useful to create tools and infrastructure that help people develop on the cloud and use the cloud to its full potential. I think a lot of those tools and infrastructure can be really tailored for regional use. Latin America has a lot of opportunities, but like many regions of the world, doesn't always have the connectivity it needs or all the computing resources it needs. And really adapting the cloud for that can be useful. And approaching this as a, starting it as an academic project, but then really spinning some of these things out into startups, into companies that can really help people develop their own companies for the cloud. That would really be a great potential. So thank you very much, and look forward to the rest of the time.
Who received his PhD in computer science from the University of London and Master of Science degree from Best Copy, and he's electrical engineer from Federal University of Rio de Janeiro. He started his career back in the 80s, participating in leading several research programs in the area of computer architecture and computer network at NIC. Federal University of Rio de Janeiro. From 1996 to 2000, he led the National Research and Education Network, R&D, period when he joined MEG and EMC² acted to put R&D in charge of the National Academic Network infrastructure. Thereafter, he was CTO of the Telemar Data Center company, T-Next. Today, briefly working in the Service Department of HP Brazil. Currently, José Luiz is head of R&D Service and Solutions Department, where he is responsible for coordinating national projects such as COMET, that's Metropolitan Community Network for Education and Research, and HUTS, that is the Telemedicine University Network. He is also one of the academic representatives in CGI.br, where he also acted as counselor from 1998 to 2000. José Luiz already represented both Brazil and in various forums and international agencies such as Internet Society, UNICAMP, LATINCloud, among others. Please welcome.
Firstly, I would like to thank the organization for the invitation to come here today and talk a little bit about what we are discussing currently at the Brazilian Research and Education Network, IEEE. My intention here is to bring to you some information on the ongoing discussions at IEEE regarding cloud services, the current status of some of the services provided by National Research and Education Networks in other parts of the world, and the opportunities that we have to partner with institutions in Brazil to build this infrastructure. One of the main questions that come up to this discussion when we talk to National Research and Education Networks is build or buy. In these discussions, we see people talking about low-risk services being deployed in public cloud services. We saw some joint contracts, National Research and Education Networks acting as cloud contractors and contract brokers as the Internet model to allow other institutions to access public services in cloud providers. Also, infrastructure services to third parties, as I said, could be a risk or could be seen as a risk in some parts of the academic community. So we have to address also this question. And in the infrastructure as a service model, National Research Networks can provide as a service provider since universities already have a long-term trust relationship with us. So in this case, National Research and Education Networks are more likely to build and operate their own infrastructure or act as a proxy for contracts with public providers. Here I have a list of the status in 2001 of most of the National Research and Education Networks in Europe. Most of them are already providing cloud services in different flavors. Some of them are under development, and few of them are already are not, in fact, planning to provide services. Internet2 started deployment of cloud services last year, 2011, and by now they have a large list of services provided as infrastructure as a service, software as a service, and even communication as a service. The Internet2 model is based on partnership. In fact, they don't own data center, they don't provide their own infrastructure. They partner with many of different US cloud service providers, and by having a umbrella contract with these companies, they allow or they facilitate the universities and research centers to contract with these providers directly under a very good business contract that they In Brazil, we have more than 300 public universities and research centers, all currently connected to our backbone. More than 72,000 lecturers and researchers, more than 250 administrative and technical personnel, and more than 1.3 million students in the public sector that are willing or somehow starting to use cloud services. So, what we need to understand there, what are the demands, what can go to the cloud, what cannot go to the cloud, how our institutions are using or planning to use these cloud services. Can we share public cloud contracts using for instance, the internet use model? Can we share computing centers resources in a cloud model for universities and research centers? So these are questions that we are discussing, we are addressing right now with our community to allow us to define the best model for the Brazilian National Research and Education Network to provide cloud services. We have a problem also in Brazil regarding the public funding model. Cloud model, by its definition, replaces investment in favor of service. However, the public sector in Brazil favors investment instead of services. We know that it's difficult to get money, but when the money comes to buy equipment, not to contract services. It's easier or less difficult to get money to buy computers, software, than to contract a third-party service. So we have a problem in this kind of proposal here. We also have the human resources aspect. We have public servants contracted by the universities, and if the universities contract services, what are they going to do? Oh. Looking at the other side, we have some human resources, technical people that are ready to work in computing services. So we have to try to get the best of both worlds. This is a service model that we are carrying out as a result of all the discussion, where we understand that we are going for a hybrid model, where we will have a part of a private cloud service, and we will have also public cloud services to offer to our community. The way we are going to share this is not yet defined. Maybe a dynamic situation. In the private cloud model, we would choose a centralized model where we would build a big data center, or we could go for a distributed and federated model where we will bring together the infrastructure and the services and the cloud services that are becoming available in our universities and research centers. And on the other side, the public cloud, we could act as a contract broker for some services that are not, the institutions are not interested in deploying themselves into their infrastructure. So we see in our backbone infrastructure, cloud infrastructure appearing everywhere. Here in Porto Alegre, Porto Alegre will have its own data center, and certainly they will do some cloud services. In Rio de Janeiro, we are talking with the National Library that we will have infrastructure for cloud services. In Brazil, we have our small data center that we are planning to upgrade. We are receiving next year 2 containers, one that will go to Manaus, another one that will go to Recife to deploy a pilot for cloud services. Telegraph will build their own data center in Fortaleza that will offer cloud services. So why not coordinate all these efforts in order to create a federated model where we can bring together all the infrastructure that are already being offered by universities and research centers. So what R&D can do? We can act as a national research and development education cloud infrastructure coordinator. We can contract both broker. We get contract broker for public cloud services. And we can also be one of the infrastructure or platform or software provider in the federated model. So this is the result of our initial studies, where we will go up in the process of providing infrastructure, platform, and software services to our community in a way that we will mix the available infrastructure provided by universities using a middleware that will allow this infrastructure to be integrated in some coordinated way, and making the proper arrangements and contracts with the public cloud. So, for instance, the managers for the IT services in universities, which are not interested in the aspects restricted to research and education projects. For instance, the IT managers are more concerned with mail services, with web services that can be contracted with public cloud providers. And the cloud researchers are more concerned with the infrastructure and the availability of storage, processing power, which we can coordinate in order to provide that infrastructure information. So that's the discussion we are starting to have now with these three kinds of groups. Well, the IT managers of the universities. The second group are the researchers that use the cloud infrastructure to deploy their projects. And the third group are you, group that develop cloud services to be implemented in this infrastructure. We intend to start promoting some seminars early next year to better understand the demands and then start the deployment of this infrastructure. And be alert, because we will make a call for specialists to join our team to help with this project in the future. Thank you.
Now we open the floor for questions. So I'm supposed to promote the fight between the two, so I have to find a point for fighting. But one point that Brian mentioned was the lack of available bandwidth to service to mobile users in the cloud, and even to reach homes. I know this is not related to R&D, this is more related to telecom providers and national plan for bandwidth. But do you foresee in the midterm, in the future, that we can overcome this barrier of bandwidth? Or at least, let's say, talking about R&D, how will the infrastructure of R&D will grow to give more bandwidth to at least to the universities?
Well, since 2002, we started a new approach to provide infrastructure services, telecommunication services to universities with the use of fiber optics. And our backbone has been upgraded since then. And now we have a backbone, I suppose, was not clear that has more than 360 aggregated gigabits of bandwidth. So there is no one city or at least capital in Brazil where we have a point of presence that's not connected to at least 1 gigabit, which is the last, or the least. Manaus, for instance, is now connected to 1 gigabit. Most of the cities are connected with 10 gigabits, more than one connections of 10 gigabits because we have redundancy. And right now we have plenty of bandwidth for academic use. The question then was how to reach the universities. One thing is to reach the capital. The other is to get to the universities. Because of this, in 2005, we started the initiative NIC.br, which is the Brazilian metropolitan network for the academic sector, which is also implementing fiber infrastructure in all Brazilian capitals. So far, we have 24 of the capitals already operating fiber optics infrastructure, which we layered this infrastructure. We didn't hire it from the company. The cables belong to IEEE. And we run the infrastructure in a consortium with the group of institutions in each of those cities. So we can go, we are operating now in 1 gigabit, but we can go to 10 gigabit to 100 gigabit by only replacing the one equipment. So in this sense, we have plenty of bandwidth, at least to reach to the most important or the biggest universities in Brazil. We have now a partnership with Telebrás to also take at least 100 megabits to the interior, to the universities in the interior of the country. And with this initiative, we hope that by 2016, we will be covering at least 600 universities with this kind of infrastructure. So for the academic community, we believe that we will be able to offer enough bandwidth for collaboration and for the development of applications that are intensive in the use of the telecommunication infrastructure. I understand that this is not enough for the urban people, for all the Brazilian population, but we also believe that we are helping to push the telcos. When we go to them and we ask for a more aggressive service in terms of infrastructure, but they will have to invest, they will have to provide more technology, and this will somehow help with the game we currently have to provide services for the rest of the population.
So, question to Brian. I forgot the name of the founder of Facebook. Yeah. It has been said that the next one will be from Brazil. Brazil has always been the country of the future. We are waiting for the future to arrive. And obviously the future is always coming to young people. And you see here, as you observe, many of them are trying to develop their tools and doing some experiments. But of course you don't know the Brazilian reality, but how can these young people that are developing their own tools goes to a level of international competition? How can I tell, okay, you're developing your tool, and next year you have your startup that you Google's will come and buy, and what kind of advice can you give to them?
Yeah, so that's a very interesting question. I mean, I think that it's easy to look at the last 10 or 12 years and where some of the larger companies have come from and say that they tend to be America. But I think that obscures the fact that there's a lot of opportunity for people all over the world to really make an impact, especially now that the internet is here, right? If you think about, for example, the Linux operating system, it was developed by a Finnish graduate student in Dorn, basically in Finland, right? And the reason that it became such a widely used platform was because he put it on the internet, and nobody cared whether it was written in Cupertino or Norway or Finland, right? And I think the same opportunity really comes here, especially when we talk about cloud services, where the cloud services are all about operating inside of the network, providing services that nobody actually has to go to the store and buy. So you don't have the problem, for example, of manufacturing phones and having to ship them to the European countries and the US. You can actually ship it just by putting it on the internet. So I think that there's definitely opportunity for that. And one thing that I thought was interesting that I read recently is that funding for American customer-facing web companies. So these are companies founded in the U.S. where they're serving American, or where they're serving users, people actually interacting with the web, has gone down by something like 40% in the last 3 or 4 years. Okay, so the money is not just flowing into American startups anymore. I think there's a lot of people out there looking for the next big thing and not necessarily thinking it has to be from some of the traditional places. And part of the reason for that is because money is going into the enterprise space, and we've seen here at the conference a lot of people developing, for example, cloud orchestration technologies which can really help enterprises make the most out of the cloud. So there's a possibility for even some of the projects maybe that we heard about in the last 2 days to use some of that funding and try and commercialize it. I think another reason that funding for US-based customer-facing startups has gone down is because a lot of the growth potential is not in the US. A lot of the growth potential is elsewhere, right? If you think about it, people want, in China, they want a Chinese version of Google, they want a Chinese version of Facebook, and I can imagine a similar sort of thing happening in Latin America, where the American or the European product doesn't really fit the needs of people here, but students that have studied in Brazil or the rest of South America that really know the needs of their friends and what they would like to see, and what they're using their phone, and they're using the web browser, and they're not getting the services they need. That's really a chance to develop some services and some startups that would help really meet those regional needs with a much lower barrier to entry. Right? The cloud gives them the ability to get this stuff going without buying a rack full of servers. It gives them the ability to do it without having to purchase a lot of manufacturing capability. And as we're hearing from the other presentation, there's a lot of opportunities now to sort of experiment with larger bandwidth on the backbone, while at the same time trying to adjust the services for the realities of some places that aren't connected directly to the backbone, or not, you're not a university student, so you don't have the same connectivity. So it's almost like the opportunities are there. You've seen from some of the talks in the last 2 days that the ideas are there. So I can very easily see it going to the next step and actually turning into companies, but not just companies, maybe even just open source products where they're available for use. They fill a real need, and therefore we're going to use them regardless of what company they started out.
Does anyone have a question?
Well, I'm not from Brazil, so I'm from the past, I'm from Canada. And we also have the same discussions about cloud infrastructure. And I think at the end of the day, for me, it really comes down to sustainability, to come up with models that can last. Because I don't know how it is in Brazil, but Canada, it's the same in the US, it was a way of a brick computer. And I would say every politician, every province, every state, in your case here, got its cloud center, with wonderful things in these cloud centers, even people are desperate to get something for their centers, because these things were just put there, money was dropped, things were built. I think the question is sustainability, how you can have a process of continuous funds. And the really tricky thing is, I understand, and again, I don't know enough about Brazil, we're going to probably have tons of money, is, when you spend money on one side of the infrastructure, I assume there's less money on the other side for funding people, for funding students. So we're kind of interested, what are your plans? I mean, how is the process going to be? Will this be that the government makes a commitment to invest every year so and so much, and there's a continuous renewal? Or is it, I personally think, more reasonable that researchers will be given a certain allotment of cloud resources, and people also have to pay, because as soon as people pay, there is this very nice incentive mechanism to think before you use something. Anything which is free, you have free water, people will just never turn off the water, just keep it running. As soon as you bill people for something, people say, we only do have the water running all day long. So it's essentially like a sustainable approach that's benefits, because we're talking after all about funds, and so taxpayers' money.
I think you reached a very important person. You said that you don't know the Brazilian reality. You seem to know. That's a problem that you face. Sometimes lack of financial support to information with students, and sometimes you see money on the other side. And so here I will, since we have an iron person here, a big shot in our appeal, make an appeal that you think most of the people that are in this workshop, in this conference, and we had a workshop before this conference, comes from the initiative of CITIC. And these are allowed to make two networks of researchers and a lot of student information. And we are very worried that this will be discontinued. We're trying to see how we can make the government sensitive to continue this initiative. So if you can join us in our lobby and try to make the program continue to be, I mean, the continuation of what we are seeing here. All this, many of these scientific production and products that we have presented here came from this student, so it would be very important to fund them. So if you can join us, it would be great. We don't need your comment, but any other good questions? Like our Canadian friend.
It's actually a follow-up on your comment. RNP has a long experience in running a different program of R&D, that's the working groups. And I find it's a very interesting model that's different from other funding agencies where you have several phases in the life cycle of a GT, where you start with an idea and then you move to a prototype and then try to transform that thing in a service, and that service might end up being incorporated as one of the services offered by RNP. And in the line of what Nelson just said, not only to push for these networks to continue their work, probably also to influence in the model how they can continue. Not just to start a new research cycle, but to progress on what they've already built so far. So I think RNP has experienced this kind of way to conduct this research project, and I think it would be interesting for the consortium to also have this kind of life cycle.
Let me just make a final observation so we can get back to our topic. Is that one of the main characteristics of these projects of CG that you can fund people. Sometimes you make a research project, some agents, and you got a lot of equipment, they don't give you money to travel to face-to-face meeting. And so I think they are afraid that people traveling will make tourism or something like that. So what the research community think is that this is one of the ideal projects that we have in CETIC. And we are very worried, not only because money will stop flowing, but all this effort will be lost. And this is something that we need to make the government sensitive to that. And so let's get back to that's an opportunity in Latin America. We did with the title of the panel. And well, I will make. You mentioned that there is a plan to have these data centers and make a national test bed of clouds. But do you think that we may run the risk, as you can see in the network test bed? There are many research test beds around the world, and people do not use it. If you go like the array, so we build a lot of infrastructure, and people just don't use it. So it would be nice if we think that to have this cloud timely and also to have incentives to make people use. I know that it's different that you use IT equipment and you use the network. If you use the network, you have to change the switches and routers, and much more difficult. I mean, it's much more difficult to change the network layer than you change the application layer. Do you think that we can have mechanisms to make this cloud infrastructure work besides the equipment and besides the continuation of CETIC?
The idea is not to offer only a test bed infrastructure. The idea is to offer a service that can be used by IT managers, as I mentioned, for ordinary services that the persons need. Also, as a platform for development of research projects in general. HPC, for instance, yesterday I saw the presentation and understand now that there's a gap between what a cloud service can offer and what the HPC community really needs, although the models seem interesting to them. And also a test bed for this community to experiment with the new applications, with the new platforms, middleware, whatever they come up with in terms of ideas and projects. So our intention is to provide a mechanism using the concepts of private and public cloud services. And how we balance this is the question right now. How much public infrastructure we are going to provide to our community, how much private infrastructure, and how we are going to coordinate the efforts that are already in place by many institutions to build their own cloud infrastructure, which will be not enough because we know that these institutions will need at least to have a mirror of their data somewhere. And if we can provide a mechanism to coordinate all these efforts and be an integrator, as we are for the research networks in terms of telecommunication and networking infrastructure, then we think we will fulfill our objective in this scenario. So I think we will address all the points that
So I think that's great. And one thing that I've seen work elsewhere, I'm not as familiar obviously with Brazilian efforts, but one thing that really helps make test beds useful and used by people is if there's a common layer of common toolkit and a common set of benchmarks, kind of a common thing that it's a software layer on top of the test bed itself, such that it's very easy for a graduate student working by themselves to run some interesting experiments, right? You know, having, for example, even something as simple as a common benchmark for cloud services that everybody could take their orchestration framework and run this benchmark against, and everybody agrees it's an apples-to-apples comparison. And that kind of toolkit, those kinds of benchmark software really has to come from the researchers, right? I mean, the agencies can provide hardware and connectivity and so on, but the thing that lives on top, which actually makes it smooth and seamless for a new researcher trying to get this project off the ground, can really come, again, from a few dedicated individuals who have, who build something and make it open source, and publish enough papers about it so that it becomes sort of de facto standard. If I want to get a paper published in cloud, I have to run the XYZ benchmark, and that's sort of the gold standard. And making that available and making it work seamlessly with this testbed is really sort of another accelerator to help make it useful for people and make sure that it's not just an infrastructure that gets deployed and never gets used.
Questions from the audience? So let's step back and make the questions to vis-a-vis. Do you think that, I mean, going back to the question that I made to Brian, we miss something in terms of entrepreneur in our system that will make ourselves competitive in international market. I know that most of like software productions is internal, that we have a software production similar to India. India is more for export. We hear from our internal market, but do you see anything that is missing that can, as you say, as we call here in Brazil, the gem of the cat,
Well, I'm not sure, but I think we're starting late. That's one problem. We spent a lot of time in the past without promoting or having the public policy for promoting interaction in Brazil. But we invested a lot of effort and money in the past in terms of human resources in preparing people. We are one of the best countries in Latin America in terms of engineers and human capacity for this. I think it's just a matter of time now. We have all the policies in place. We have the government agencies investing in projects. Also for the industry, the law that allows researchers to work together with industry is there. I think it's just a matter of time now for the new generations to understand their opportunities and to break also this culture that university is one side and industry is another side. We have both to work for the same objective to make the country bigger and to provide more solutions, more products for the whole world. So for me, just a matter of time, we'll get there.
So again, I don't know if you go to Brazil, it's different, but I'm from, I live in Silicon Valley. I think you're right. I think it gets to a point where it's sort of like just takes off because you have enough people, you have enough resources. One thing that's nice about Silicon Valley is that there is this pool of engineers. The people, they all have jobs, but they're willing to move from their job to a startup. And so it's a good place to start a company, primarily because you can hire good people without making them move, right? And it's the same kind of thing here. If you get enough engineers, enough people who understand technology in this area, then it's almost like it becomes, startups have to come here as opposed to somewhere else, because this is where the talent is, where the resources are. And we see that happening in other American cities as well, to some degree in New York and Los Angeles, but I think it can happen anywhere. I think you get enough people who are well educated, who understand how to use these services to build interesting new technologies, and suddenly it becomes like a flashpoint, and now all the startups happen here because this is where all the action is.
Questions? Anyone looking for opportunities? It's the title. Yeah. So
Hello. Well, my question is for José Luis. The point is, there's some kind of project that can self-support. My point is, my feeling is that in Brazil, when a project starts, it defines the deliverables, it defines the goals, the people involved, the budget. But when the project ends, like, okay, ended, let's start a new project. Is there any kind of project that it's like self-generates the money to keep it going, and don't need to create a new project and create a new demand of money from R&D?
You mean specifically started by
in Brazil?
We still have a problem in terms of what I would call the production chain. We start a project, as you said, but once the research stage of the project finishes, we don't have yet the way to connect to the rest of the production chain. I mean, to transform it into a pilot that will be self-funded or have funding from other companies interested in evaluating that product. And after that, the other stage would be to transform it into a real product. We still don't have it. There are very short number of projects that have passed all the way through this chain and transform into a real product. At R&D itself, we have at least one of this, which is the hardware and software that now provides the encrypted certificates for the ATU community, and which is now a product. It's a box, a hardware box, much cheaper than the one you can buy from abroad, and is being used by the sector as the .br certificates, national certificates. This is one of the cases of success that we can tell that started at R&D as a research project and now it's a product.
Questions? Actually, we are almost reaching the time our panelist has to take a flight, so I would like to ask you if you two both have some final words to the audience, like some advice.
So, definitely I think that there's a lot of people in the world that would argue that cloud is sort of a buzz thing, or like a hype thing, and then more of a marketing term than really something that's real. But I don't actually believe that that's true underneath. I mean, people tend to attach the word cloud and stuff they want to sell. But I think what we've seen in the last 2 days, and I think what we've seen in general over the last few years, is that there is really interesting technology underneath. Even if it doesn't always end up being called cloud, there's sort of this notion that there's a large pool of servers that is run as a service that you can use for various things. And I think the thing that makes it not a buzzword and not hype, but actually real technology, is taking some of the ideas and actually making them real. And so it's very clear as you see these projects which are trying to do this, trying to develop open source technologies to make it available. I think it really is important to not just chase whatever the latest fad is and actually continue developing this technology, because there is really a lot of potential there. And one thing that is interesting to me, I mean, I used to work in a university, now I work in a company, so I've kind of seen both sides. You know, there's sort of this thing that the technology needs to be developed, right? And if the universities don't develop it correctly, the companies are going to develop it incorrectly, right? We're going to do it no matter what. You might as well tell us the right way to do it that actually has sound scientific opinions and sound scientific principles and has gone through a rigorous evaluation and review, or we're going to develop something that's not quite as good. So there's really an opportunity to do that and to influence the way this technology moves forward, whether it's called cloud or something else. And I really look forward to seeing what comes out of the research community in general, and this one in particular, over the next few years.
Well, when the organization of this event asked for some funding support for the Brazilian Internet Steering Committee, I was in charge, at least I was charged with the mission of evaluating the request as a member of the steering committee. And I gave very strong support to this event. And they came here not to see if I was right, but to make sure that we have all the good researchers or the persons that are doing good research in Brazil. And I can see they are all here. And the results coming up. Many projects that I saw during these 2 days will certainly be services, products, or will help to develop further services and products in our community. So I'm very glad. I thank Lisandro for the invitation to come here. And I wish you all very good and success to what we're going to do. We're starting to do right now. And we hope that IEEE will help some of you to deploy these ideas that you started with your projects. Thank you.
I'd like to thank Jose Luis and Brian for this enlightening panel, and I hope to have you too in future events in Brazil.